Hi, I'm Leanpub from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Leanpub podcast, I'll be interviewing Anne-Marie Charrett. Based in Sydney, Anne-Marie is a product leader and advocate for quality software engineering, navigating change, and ensuring quality remains top of mind for everyone on a team. She is currently working at Telstra, where she is the principal of test automation tooling. You can follow Anne-Marie on LinkedIn at Testing Times, and check out her website at annemariecharrett.com and sign up for her newsletter there as well. She's also a popular conference speaker, and you can find a number of great talks by her on YouTube. Anne-Marie is the author of the Leanpub book, The Quality Coach's Handbook, Mastering the Quality Coach Role in Organizations. In the book, Anne-Marie explains the quality coach role and how to perform it, including workshops with instructions and templates of great value for people in senior engineering leadership and many other roles. In this interview, we're going to talk about Anne-Marie's background and career, her book, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about her experience writing the book and being a self-published author. So thank you very much, Anne-Marie, for being on the Leanpub podcast.
Thanks, Len. It's great to be here.
Thanks. I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up, how you found your way
Yes,
into a career in software engineering and coaching and, Australia.
absolutely. Yeah. Well, uh, so I've always wanted to be an engineer since I was 13. And I'm not sure exactly why, but when I told people I wanted to be an engineer, I got a really good reaction. And that kind of went, oh, really? Because at the time, female engineers wasn't necessarily a very common thing. And so, yeah, I kind of nailed onto that one. I thought, oh, this is a good story. I'll stick to this one. But when as I did engineering, I kind of really loved the analytical side of trying to understand why things are the way they are. I think that's sort of my perennial question in the back of my head is how does this work? Why is it working this way? What's the system behind behind the actual, all the complex systems? What's the thinking behind there, and how do people approach solving problems? Really fascinates me. So when I did engineering, it was a great opportunity to really focus on a discipline, right? And I focused on at the time, telco was a big thing. So I was looking at sort of, satellites and, trying to identify how to actually look at developing chips and things like that, for satellites. It was just a really interesting way of kind of harnessing what was interesting for me, that the analysis and understanding. So yeah, that's sort of how I got into engineering.
Did you study it at university?
I did. Yeah. I studied it. I actually took it the hard way. I find I tend to do things the hard way. So I didn't quite get enough points in my maths to actually do pure engineering. So I took a tech degree in Dublin, which turned out to be way harder than the engineering degree. Um, Interesting enough. And then I went to the UK, went to London, studied engineering in Middlesex University, I think it's called now. And yeah, studied and specialized in telecommunications. And once I left there, I hit the early 90s and it was a recession time. And I think found it really hard to find a job and ended up working in a patent office, uh, copy and pasting patents because computers weren't very common around then. And yeah, but quickly when I arrived in Australia, I kind of ended up focusing in on telco, went and worked for Nortel Networks, which you might have heard of, but now defunct. Did some really interesting work in the R&D space there, down in Wollongong in Australia, and really cemented a lot of my, I guess, testing, pulling things apart, trying to figure out why they don't speak to each other when the standard says they should conform. I think this was sort of, but why is it not working? Or what is it? Because engineering, and according to the protocols, it should absolutely work because it's compliant to the standard. And I think that sort of really fascinated me. And um, I'm a very curious person by nature, and this just wouldn't stop digging until I found out and understood why.
Yeah, that's a really great story. One of the sort of I don't know what it is about like in self-published authors or independently published authors, but they move around a lot. in their careers. I mean, it's part of a sign of our times. But so one of the funny, sort of very specific sub themes of this is I moved to London in 1999. And so I always like to ask people if that's part of their story. Where did you live when you were in London?
Oh, I was in a couple of places, Cockfosters up
Yep.
north,
Yep.
and the other place was, I've forgotten the name of it, something Green, I was in East London, Bethnal Green.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah,
There you
yeah.
go.
So I was there. They had this 24-hour bagel shop, which was amazing. But yeah, it was just a really kind of alive place to be in London at the time.
That's really exciting. And how did you find your way
Yeah.
to Australia?
Ah, well, that's another story. So, so I had moved at that point. I had moved back to Dublin, and I basically traveled to Australia. My mum's got Australian citizenship, which we didn't really know about until I was after 18. We were all disgusted. Like, why didn't you tell us? I could all, yeah. But yeah. So I discovered, and then I had this Australian cousin came over, and she was looking to travel through Thailand. And I'd always wanted to go to Thailand. So I thought, why not? Like give this a go. And at the time, I was recovering from a broken heart. So, my dad was like, just go and travel. So I did. And then I arrived up in Australia for what was meant to be 3 months. And I don't know how many, 30 years later, I'm still here with two kids of my own. So we are probably going to travel and go back to Dublin or something.
Yeah, no,
But yeah.
that's just really fantastic to hear. That what a great story, and I'm glad you found a new home there and a place to stay. I've had one or two friends have the same thing happen, whichever country it is they're sort of coming from or going to. They just kind of land in a place and they belong there, or find.
Yeah, yeah. I think you have to like you'll always feel like you've got one foot in both countries. I don't think there's ever getting away from that. And I regularly go back to Europe to visit family and friends and stuff. But I think you have to be forward looking and give the country that you're in the best shot you can. I think if you're always constantly looking backwards, you're never going to really feel like you belong. And it takes a while to belong in a new country. Like, even if the language is the same and everything is supposedly the same, it's different. So I think,
Yeah,
yeah, that sense of who you are and being is a real takes time. Yeah.
no, definitely. I've got to say personally, I miss being an expat. I like being treated like a foreigner, basically. Like I like being
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
belong there. There's something about like my personality. Maybe I feel I just don't belong here generally, and
Right,
to
right.
be treated kind of, I find it kind of presumptuous when people assume, oh, you're from here, so you must be like me in all these
Mm,
different
mm.
ways and have all these shared interests. And it's like
Yeah.
people beings are too different from each other for
Yeah, yeah.
that to usually.
Yeah. That is yeah, interesting. I'll have to think about that one. Yeah.
I'm curious, how you found your way into testing. Was there a
Yeah.
moment that it happened, or was it just your interest in figuring out how things work that kind of led you there?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was the only test engineer at Nortel Networks. I was hired as a test engineer, but mostly because I'd been developing I'd been developing, I was coding test automation scripts for European standards when I was in Europe. So I had sort of been writing this test automation for layer 3, layer 4 protocols. And when I arrived in Australia, it's sort of the test bit was easier to get a job with. And since I was down to my last $10, I wasn't going to be too picky. Um, and so I ended up in this testing role, but I actually really, really loved it. I mean, again, going back to that, trying to understand why. And I think having an engineering background, I'm not like the ability to go down deep and technical um, was just natural for me. That you would dive into the actual protocols and understand exactly what was going on. And I think then combining that with that ability to have that systems wide approach about a product, and is this fit for purpose? That type of question, I think having those two talents and those two strengths really is a great contribution for a team. And it's, it sort of, it served me well to think like that. And I remember taking this time. They offered me the opportunity to go in and develop for, to work as a developer. And so I did, and I went back into coding, and I actually did not enjoy it at all because I kept on thinking beyond, the little bit of work I was working on. And it was like, well, how does this fit into this other part of the system? And my brain kept on wanting to go beyond the scope. So clearly I have some sort of syndrome that once kept on wanting me to look outside of what I was doing. And I think that testing allowed me to play into that strength. Whereas for me, for coding, it was constantly a sort of battle to keep focused on deliver what is in front of me and build the thing rather than stop thinking about why it won't work. You know?
Yeah, that seems to be a theme of your work that I sort of learned a little bit about reviewing things about, when I was preparing for this interview. For example, I was just listening to a YouTube video that I think was from a conference where you gave a keynote speech. YouTube doesn't give great dates, but like a year ago, where one thing you talked about was how command and control kind of management styles can lead to having the sort of people being commanded be passive.
Yep. Mm, mm,
And as opposed to what you were just describing, which is like, I want to be active. I want to have whatever my
mm,
goal is within the thing. I want to have an
mm,
understanding of the whole and, be able to direct my efforts somewhat independently based on
mm.
that knowledge and understanding.
Yeah, I think this whole concept of, I mean, I was never, you can never tell me anything. Heck up, like it is quite, I have to learn it my way. And over the years I've had to kind of, I've had to learn how to play nicely. But I think it's really important, especially for engineers, that they get an opportunity to learn through doing. And they that is how people learn, especially engineering, and it's not through kind of forced information fed into people. And I think when you get that, when you try it, you have a culture of that sort of, I don't know, enforced passiveness. Because I don't think people are naturally that way. I think people naturally want to learn and learn new things. I think it's really hard because people kind of are are taught to sit and wait. That's the safe place. It's like the system outside it is encouraging people to behave in that manner. It's not like they want to do that. I mean, for example, the team that's managing the legacy system for 20 years that has never been given a budget has a major, you know, outage. And it's, when you go through a performance review, like a PIR or an incident review, and you try and analyze and you look at some of the practices, and they're not ideal practices. Um, and I think, why is that the case? Well, because to some degree, it's in the team has been driven by systems behind it, by not giving budget, by not encouraging them to have ownership and pride of their work. I think it sort of, it enforces this kind of culture. And yeah, I think it's really hard to break that because you have to build trust, and building trust and helping people believe that they're not going to get stomped on because, um, or blamed because of what they're doing is really hard to break that culture. And it's why I focus very much on experimentation, because experimentation gives people a safe way to try new things. And they don't have to be massive experiments. They can be small experiments that sort of can work within a sprint, or, that's sort of this consistent experimentation, continuous learning. And, I think those things are really, really important for teams to feel like that they're learning new things and they're engaged. So
Yeah, that's very interesting. It reminds me of something that you said in the book. I mean, when I'm thinking about just high level kind of culture and how that can affect everybody all the way
mm,
down. You mentioned in your book something that kind of like, I'm sure I've heard this, but like I've heard versions of this before. But a team. We're talking about software team here, where there's like the testers are a team unto themselves, and the developers are conceived of as a separate team.
mm,
Testers
mm,
are sometimes tasked with testing software without actually being told what the requirements where for anyone
100%.
listening,
Yeah.
requirements
Yeah.
being a technical term in software development, we're like, what are the requirements? Meaning, what are we building the software to do?
Mm,
Just I think
mm,
the idea uh, of someone being asked to test something whose purpose they haven't hasn't been communicated to them.
mm,
What kind
mm.
of a culture does that come out of?
Yeah, really interesting question. What d- I think there's many reasons why it could be like that. And I think like I often like to look at startups and say people think like, oh, startups is amazing culture where everyone's so collaborative and they work together because they're so close. But actually, that's not the case. Like you can go into startups that are really, really toxic culture, where people are forced to behave in a way, in a certain way. And you can sort of see cultures begin to be entrenched in like even small companies. And you can see that that's sort of the culture where it's heading almost. And I like to say, it's the things that you walk past that determine your culture. You have to make trade-offs in a small startup. You're constantly making trade-offs and prioritizing things, and that's okay. But you have to own those decisions because you're potentially embedding that into a culture of we will be making choices. Obviously, when I'm thinking about quality, you're making choices about quality on a daily basis. You are entrenching your culture by doing that as well. So I think I'm just trying to remember what the question was again.
Just
I
how could it come about? Like I mean, a lot of things that sort of are kind of standard within industries can seem like they
mm,
violate common sense to people from the
well,
outset.
yes,
So
that's
yeah,
right. Yeah,
testers don't are told to test a system whose purpose they haven't been told.
yeah. I think when you look at sort of the bad old waterfall days, you know, the bad old waterfall days where we're all forced to work with written down requirements, we're actually and the testers were always independent. They were seen as the gatekeepers of quality. And so we had this enforced segregation where, you wanted to keep, the idea was to keep the testers kind of pure away from the
Right.
from the details so that they could come in and sort of go, yes, this is working, this isn't, right? Um, and I think that that works to some degree, like the intent is great, but clearly the feedback loops are shocking, right? So if you think about the time it takes to get feedback from a team that it doesn't get involved, is only looking at the written requirements to the time software is delivered. And you're talking about years, like 11 months to deliver something then in those waterfall days at minimum. So like I think that sort of, the advent of agile was to break through some of that to get that early feedback. And of course, where does that lead the testers in that team? Like testers are predominantly providing feedback, right? And so how do they work into that loop and how do they get that feedback? And I think to some degree with that shift towards agile, I think a lot of those classic requirements we did away with, like purposefully, right? Because we kind of wanted to be more iterative and fluid and allow feedback, and it wasn't a formal sign off, and we were going to change requirements as they go. And I think people sort of, really didn't sort of, if you look at the manifesto, we're not a lot of testers in that room talking about, that impact. And I think one of the shames of that movement at the time, I understand I wasn't there at the time, but I understand that actually testing kind of moved away from the agile manifest. A lot of the testers kind of saw themselves as a different brand. They weren't, and there was a division to some degree at that point. And I think that's harmed everyone because I think we haven't really had that. We still haven't had that tough conversation of how do we build quality in? How do we build for quality apart from just automating all the things? Like that seems to be our only solution to quality at the moment is just let's just automate it all. And I think it's absolutely part of the conversation. And it's a really, really important part of the conversation, but it's not the only one, right? There's so much more to quality as ever, um, especially from a user perspective. And if you think about today, where I think we've over-indexed on sort of automation to some degree, and we get this, enshittification of products. Like, how did they come about? Why has that happened? Because I think we've kind of taken our eyes a bit off what quality is for the consumer and over-indexed on what quality is for the shareholders, right? How do we bring that back? And I think testers play a big part in that. So how do we get here? I think there's a constant battle. It is a constant battle of trying to build quality systems. They're hard. It's hard to build quality products. It's not easy. We would have fixed this ages ago if it was easy.
It's fascinating. You've actually covered a lot of kind of programming and kind of, IT history there, with words that some people might not be familiar with, like waterfall, for example. If you want to know how were software projects originally done when it became a big industry, it was like somebody like wrote out every single step that needed to be carried out. And in fact, this is reminding me, I interviewed a tester, I think it was from Australia, David Greenlees years ago, whose first job as a software tester was like, literally, here's a sheet of check boxes, do these things in a row. So if you want to think about the kind of like it was worked well for devising moon missions when you had very little computing power and stuff like that. And it worked well for all kinds of legacy systems, like you talked about, the 20-year-old ones or 30 or 40-year-old ones that are still in use were probably made that way. But when basically the internet became a thing and, you could actually, and a lot of software products could be easily updated because they were easily updatable. You didn't sort of print them off on a disk and send out 10 million copies
That's
and
right.
cross your fingers that everything worked. So then agile became a thing, where we've had a couple of the agile manifesto people on the podcast in the past. So it's basically like, look, we don't need to work that way anymore. Things have changed. There's better ways of doing things. And that helped to empower kind of people at all levels of producing products and seeing problems and foreseeing problems and things like that. And then you got continuous integration and continuous delivery and stuff like that started to happen. But one of the things, but then we get to enshittification, I believe Cory Doctorow's term, and you talk about sort of like right at the beginning of the book, basically. And let's move on to talk about the book, the Quality Coach's Handbook, about how basically, because bugs can be fixed so quickly now, basically, what a lot of companies have done is, I think you have this great phrase where you say they've put the risk, they've sort of limited risk in a sense because you can fix problems easily. And you said they've put it in the bank, or instead of putting it in the bank, I think, I forget the exact image. They're basically spending the risk by just pumping out features all the time to try and compete with other people. And so why everything is kind of a little bit at least broken all the time is because the practice now is to try and show that you're adding value all the time, and we'll fix the problems after they're
100%. And I think I see this. I mean, I think I say in my book, I had a conversation with the VP of engineering once who basically said, if we don't have incidents in production, there's a problem, right? We're going too slowly. And it's just that mentality that, and I think it's Elizabeth Hendrickson who coined this phrase, recoverability over perfection. And this concept where rather than trying to get things absolutely perfect before we ship the CD, we can now recover from this rapidly. So it's how do we observe our systems in production? How can we recover from incidents in production? And how can our risk profile changes because of that, right? We can say, okay, well, maybe our testing doesn't need to be, as long as it was before, because we can afford to have some incidents in production because we can fix them. So I think there's definitely an engineering leadership when you look at SaaS products, when you look at cloud computing and all those, it leans to that sort of that way of thinking. And an interesting thing, I heard a conversation recently about sort of impact of AI on this, right? And how really we're almost going to become to the point where we're going to, because if you have AI in our systems, we're not going to be able to, they're non-deterministic, right? And so if you think about test automation, you have to have an expected result that you can rely on, right? So every time, you're expecting 10, you get 10, the test case passes, right? But with AI, you might get 11 or 12 or 13, right? And they might all be right. And so, how does test automation work in that field? Well, it doesn't work so well. So then it's like we're going to even more index onto recoverability because, the potentially that we need to get better in our recoverability, better in our observation of our life systems. And it's Charity Majors from Honeycomb, who basically says, well, actually, our consumers are testing your product every single day. They just don't realize they're testing it. They're using it in ways that they don't even realize, like that have never been realized for its use. They're doing things completely differently to how they were intended. And so they're effectively testing that. So how can you get better at looking at underneath the hood in production and feeding that information back into your feedback loops and using that to help get better quality? So I think that's where a lot of work is heading. I think it's fascinating. You can get really scared by that as a tester and go, oh my God, my work is, I'm going to lose my job. Or you can look at it and say, well, this is really interesting. How can I use my analytical skills, and how do I use my ability to identify risk? How can I use my ability to understand what good looks like? How do I use my curiosity in the production space, right? And how do I use that there? So I think there's the whole thing about my book is trying to create a space for quality professionals in a world that is rapidly changing. And I have been a tester myself. I think quality professionals have so many amazing skills, and I've met them all along the way. They are incredible people. They do a really tough job. They're often undervalued. People are constantly trying to get rid of the number of testers in a organization. So it's a tough job, right? And you need to have a certain amount of resilience to be a quality professional. And so I think we need those people, and I want to find places for them in our new world of engineering. And I think they're there. They're definitely there. We just need to, they might not be called tester. They might be called something different. But those skills, we definitely need them in engineering. And I like to try and create spaces for those people.
Yeah, yeah, you have a very specific definition of quality coach near the beginning of your book, and you talk about the sort of history of a quality assessment and where that term comes from and things like that. So you situate it, but it's very interesting the way you frame it as there's this moment of big change. It's not the first one, but every moment of big change is unique. And you have this great story at the beginning where you talk about a team where the software engineers or developers and the testers were on different teams, and they were you were brought in to sort of you foresaw some bottleneck in this company that was scaling up, and you sort of
Mm,
integrated the testers into the different teams, and that the testers learned from the engineers, and the engineers learned from the testers, and stuff like that.
mm,
But then one day, a tester came up to you and said, if I recall the story correctly, something along the lines of, "The engineers know how to test now. What do we do?" And so this is, I think, a good way of telling the story of what the quality coach is. So if you could, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. What is a quality coach?
Yeah. So this is probably where I should be able to rattle off my definition,
I've
which
got it
I
for you.
cannot do. Much. But really, if you think about sort of a team that is a quality coach is someone who is typically has a background in testing or some element of quality, but they don't have to. But this person is passionate about quality and is able to coach a team to help them understand how to think about quality, how to build it in, how to remember to ask questions about quality. And I think that's really important because sometimes trying to go so fast, nobody's got time to think. And so that person's there to help coach the team and understand about testing, because testing is not taught at universities. So engineers don't come out with an understanding of how to test. Maybe they'll do a tiny bit on unit testing if they're lucky, but it's not a huge part of an engineering course. So the need for someone to help them understand what good looks like in terms of testing is important. And my experience is a lot of people don't know. They think they're doing an amazing job with testing, but it's actually quite basic. And you want to help people and teams get good at quality because that takes the pain away later, right? And nobody wants long feedback loops where it takes forever to find out that there was a problem. And they've moved on to working on something else. And now they've got to go back to the thing that they were working on maybe 4 weeks ago and go, oh, what was I doing? Like, and it's just an unpleasant place for everyone to be in. So helping teams to think about quality, to get their testing frameworks right, to think about asking the right questions about risk, that is the quality coach helps embed that knowledge into the team.
So yeah, just getting down to kind of brass tacks. So let's say I'm a technical team lead, or I'm a manager or something like that, and I'm like, I've noticed that we've got just problems with quality from the output from my team. If I want to bring in a quality coach, what does that look like? Do they sit with the team? Do they attend meetings with the team? Do they come in and go, I'm the quality coach, here's a workshop? Do they watch what the team does for a while before giving feedback? Are they in all the meetings? What would it, if I'm the manager, what does it look like to me that's happening with my team?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's not an easy question to answer, to be honest, because a lot of this depends on the team, right? And I've seen teams that they're just not ready to have a quality coach. And I'm like, come back to me when you can breathe, you know. And I've had teams that are super passionate. So I say that how you approach a new team, it really depends on the team's motivation at that point in time, and also their level of skills. So depending on their motivation and their ability in testing, you will approach that team in different ways. So for example, if the team is like, absolutely, look, we want to improve our testing. We get it, it's not great. Come in and help us. Like, I would be absolutely going into workshops, and helping them facilitate conversations depending on the area that they have the most pain. So if it was test automation, functional test automation is a very common area for teams to kind of ask for support. Let's focus on that. Let's do an experiment in this space. And as much as possible, I try and get the team to own that decision making and own that quality, because they need to be owning the quality. It's their quality, is not what, so depending on that sort of level of trust I've built out with the team, I can do, various degrees of that facilitation. So it's a lot of facilitation in this role. But then there's also teams that are just really not ready. There's a lot of marketing and there's a lot of coaching upwards. So maybe the engineering manager actually needs some coaching on quality, on quality and what that means and what the team needs in order for the team to be able to do it. So I'll give you an example. Like the team is doing, certain features and products. They're working on certain stories, and stories are kind of mini requirements. And but there's no time for test automation maintenance and that, right? So I can coach the team until the cows come home. But if the engineering manager is not facilitating time and space for work to be done, then it's like, and if the team doesn't have a lot of agency in that decision making, then it's really hard, no matter how great the team is, to take on the work. So sometimes I have to go up a level and have those conversations and explain what is needed at a higher level in order to be able to give the teams the space to be able to do the work that needs to be done.
Yeah, that's funny. I've never been in that role myself, but I've interviewed many authors who've written books about similar kinds of things, or being in similar kinds of certain circumstances. And it sounds like one of the hardest things in this kind of role is convincing a manager that they should slow down their production in order to do testing. When you say freeing up space, that means, freeing up time, giving people more time to do testing, to work on testing. A certain kind of person might be like, well, that just extends the deadline out. This feature's going to be ready, right? So like, that doesn't mean they're going to say no, but that means you have to have, I think you talked about influence language, or
Mm.
fluent skills or something like that. And that's where the quality manager comes in. You actually have to have this kind of meta awareness of what the business is doing and being able to talk its talk.
Yeah. And so currently where I am right now, I spend most of my time talking to senior leadership about like the why and how else to think like and helping them understand potentially what good looks like and sort of speaking in their language to be able to give the team space to be able to do some forms of experimentation. It's a really important role, and you've got to constantly do that. It's never ending. Like you can't just speak to a VP of engineering once and just go, okay, well now they understand. It's like this constant messaging that you've got to do over a length of time, and yeah, it's really important work. So
Yes.
agreed.
Speaking of terminology, you've got a great. Sometimes these terms can seem interchangeable, but so you've got a great. I would love your section in your book on when to coach, mentor, or train, and you talk about these are different teaching message or methods. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that for people who've always been confused by the terminology. What's the difference between coaching, mentoring, and training?
Yeah. So I think like I'll put this into my words, so it might not totally reflect the book, but uh, so for me, like when you look at training and you think about sort of pushing information outwards. So this is what you must do. This is what you must learn. This is, it's very one way directional. Does not imagine yourself in a lecture room with 200 other, university students, that very directional one way um, information is only going in one way. With mentoring, it's also going one way, but it's the other way. So a mentor typically sits there waiting for I hate the word mentee, but mentee comes in and kind of goes, "Can you help me with this?" And they will like say, "Sure, absolutely. Have you looked at this bit of information? Have you looked at that information? What, like," and so it's still one directional, but it's sort of the other way round. And the way I see coaching is that it's very much it's right sort of in the middle between the two because it's asking the coach, the person who's being coached is still coming in asking the question, how do I do this? But rather than just giving the information, the coach is going, well, what do you think it should be? So they're using a more of a, inquiry method to help the person think through the problem rather than actually solving the problem for that person. So that's how I kind of look at the three different approaches.
Yeah, that's really great. One question I have is so for someone who's like in a quality coach kind of role or aspiring to be in one or hiring someone to be in one. I know it's sort of like, it's both easy and hard to sort of generalize, but like if someone were dropped into say a 250 person software company right now in
Mhm.
2025 and like it's June 3rd, um, or for me, uh, what would be the most common big scary problem that they would be confronting right now? And like, I mean, I know everybody would want to say AI, and that might be the case.
Look, uh, I mean, AI to me, AI is a tool. So, is it scary? I think the biggest thing is still the same problems that we have been facing all the time. It's how do we get quality? How do we ship features out the door at a high quality, and not sacrifice speed? Like we're constantly, ever since the Iron Triangle came out in the 1970s, we've still been wrestling with this, right? Now, test automation has professed to solve this problem for us. But in the reality, if you just open like the the lid of any test automation pot in any organization, it's going to be pretty unhealthy. Um, it's more rare, I think, to have clean test automation than it is to have uh, um, a mess. And there's a number of reasons for that, and they're all genuinely good people trying to do the right thing. But often you'll hear about test automation scripts that take 5 days to run. It's like, well, how did we get here? And like thousands and thousands of test automation scripts that nobody's kind of gone through and actually pulled out and deleted old test automation scripts because everyone's too scared it might allow a bug into the system, right? And so you have this kind of reluctance to take anything away. But I think that sort of creates rigidity in the system itself, and that prevents you from being flexible and agile and responding to change, right? So those are the constant challenges that we have. AI kind of is helping solve some of those problems, to be honest. And I think the some of the traits of quality professionals, the curiosity, how do we know something is true? Does it matter? Those sorts of deep questions that testers often bring into a team are super helpful when you're trying to analyze AI and where it should be gone, where it should be used. I mean, I think in particular, it's like, being responsible about your AI. And, it's a lot of the testers certainly in the testing community and the quality professional community are raising questions about the ethics of AI and just because we can, should we? And I think these are really important questions we need to be looking at. And just for ourselves, even if we end up using AI, it's like to be able to have gone through that critical thinking and that considered thought about how we apply AI to our systems is, I think, for our own humanity is important. So I think they not to be afraid of. It's not. I don't see it as a problem. The only problems I see are more ethical problems, and then technical problems. Like in our organization at the moment, we have responsible AI guidelines, and we have to, and I think they're good. It's like, what is the problem you're trying to solve with AI? Like, do you understand what you're trying to do? Is it a good problem to be using this for? And that reflection and that consideration is really important. Because I think it can do amazing things. It's like I have used like AI in different places, and I think it's amazing. Like some of the stuff it's done, it's just so powerful in some ways.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's very interesting too, that thing about should I be using it for this is actually like,
mm,
like one thing, I don't know, because of my age or whatever, the analogy I always bring up for things like this is when cell phones became a thing, everybody had their ringer on all the time. You actually paid for special ringers, which was incredibly rude and annoying. And we got over that pretty quickly. That sometimes you encounter someone who still does that. But that was stupid. And we need
mm,
to get over it. And one thing that you're seeing now, like the discourse is evolving pretty quickly, but there's a lot of people who seem to think that the reason you write an essay in university class is to have the output. So now if I
mm, mm,
use GPT to get the output, I've completed
mm.
the task.
Yeah,
And it's like
yeah,
if the
yeah,
actual task was thinking
yeah,
about it and then
yeah.
communicating persuasively about it, that second part
Mm,
might have some AI. Definitely in your professional career and blah blah will have AI that will just be a part of writing going forward. But the thinking it through part, it's like, oh wait, I shouldn't use the AI to
mm,
think it through, or at least only in a very special way. If my goal is to understand something, that's what I'm using
mm.
the AI for. If I'm using it, not just to sort of skip understanding it and get to the output.
Yeah, 100. Like I am just, nodding away here because I think it's potentially, our propensity to take a shortcut is very deep in our human psyche. And it is very, very tempting, especially when you've got systems that put you under pressure. I think it's hard. It's very hard. And yeah, it's going to be interesting times ahead for sure for all of us.
And just before we move on to the last part of the interview, I got to
Yeah.
share a specific story about a job interview story I heard recently. So someone was on a job interview and they were on some Zoom or something like that. And when they were asked a question, they slowly did this. And like there was like a minute or two gap before they read out an answer from an AI. And it was a
Oh,
classic
yeah,
example of like
yeah.
not understanding that the whole point of that might be used, that will definitely 100%
Mm,
useful in other circumstances.
yeah.
But in this one, reflect on what you're doing here. You're supposed to be showing that you can solve problems, that you could come
Mm,
up with
mm,
descriptions and stuff like that. And I just love that way you put it about like reflecting on what should I be using it for and what shouldn't I be using
mm.
it for, and what in what circumstances, the kind of like, thing that we're all kind of going through now. Um, Moving on, in the last part of the interview, I always like to talk to the author about their experience writing, and about the origin story of their book. I know you talk about how you've been working on your book for 10 years, and it's sort of like it's been worked on various ways along the way. So I was wondering if you could just tell us the story of that journey. What were the things that worked, and well, the things that didn't work, and then the things that ultimately finally did.
Yeah, for sure. Because I mean, it was really interesting. I started writing this book, what I think it was about 2015, and I had so much content in my head, and I had all these ideas brimming, and I knew that I wanted to share them, and that they were ideas that weren't necessarily commonplace, and so I really wanted to put those words out there. So I started writing this book on my laptop in by myself. I actually think I was using Leanpub a little bit as well, but I wasn't publishing it, and I was keeping it internally, and I was working on it. And I started working. I got to about a third of the book, what I reckoned was about a third of the book, and I suddenly realized that it had taken me quite a while, but it was also starting to become out of date because I'm writing about technical stuff, which moves really, really quickly. And I was getting new ideas all the time. So I'm like, oh, no, no, I'm going to revise that idea now because based on this new information I've just heard from working in a different company, like this is contextual. So I got to go back and fix that up. So I kept on going back, and I did this 3 times with the book. I actually wrote a third of the book 3 times by myself. And on the third one, I kept on changing format, structure. And I started realizing, you know what? I'm never going to finish this book. I'm just like, I'm too much of a perfectionist, and I am being very, very precious about sharing this out. Haven't shared it out with anyone. I was very kind of controlling about sort of being the author and, this is my content. I had actually approached a few other agencies, like publishing companies, and then they just never really worked out for me. They kept on encouraging me to do things in different ways, and was I don't know, this was like my baby. um, so anyway, I hit on this idea of actually uh, no, well, not self publishing, but creating an online book basically. And so I had always had a blog. And so what I decided to do is I would start charging people on a monthly basis for my writing. And it was really a small amount. It's like $1 a month. And I said, if you subscribe to my blog, I will commit to writing and publishing once a month content, and I will put it out there for everyone to see. And I think this kind of broke something in me. It kind of forced me to not be so precious about my content and let other people see it, and let other people, and kind of, help me realize that the world wasn't going to, people weren't going to go, oh my God, that's terrible, and it helped me kind of get through that sort of trying to rewrite, get the book perfect for the first third of the book perfect. And so I did that for about 4 years, and gradually I grew up my subscriber base from, I think it was like 20 or 30 to 1,000 members over 4 years. Not all of them were paying for the book, but they were all invested in following the content and knowing about sort of, I had a monthly kind of, this is what's happening in the community as well, sort of sharing other people's articles related that were very closely linked to my one. So I kind of started building this subscriber base as well, which I hadn't realized at the time would be useful when I went to publish the book,
Right.
but it's turned out to be hugely useful. So yeah, so that really helped me get to the point where I had 4 years worth of content, like one a month. So, and I extracted that all from the blog. And but then I had to rewrite, because I realized how you write in a blog is very different to how you write in a book. But at least for me it is. And I was very social in my blog, and I wanted to be more direct and concise in my books. So I hired an editor, Fiona Charles, who helped me through some of the editing process to clean up all my terrible spelling and grammar. Yeah, we worked through that. We've been working on that now for we were working up the last few months. So, and that sort of brought to the point where I realized I needed a couple of extra art chapters to there were some gaps. Of course, the perfectionist in me, or it's kind of constantly fiddling, but managed to kind of control myself to some degree and drew the line in for the end of May and said, that's it, it's going out, whether I like it or not. And so, yeah, on the 31st of May, I just hit the button and here we are.
Yeah, well, congratulations on finishing and hitting the publish button.
Yeah.
That's always so exciting.
Thank you.
Great to hear that story. You reminded me something. I'll probably write a blog post about this sometime soon. But one of the things that has just been coming to the fore in my own talking with authors and things like that lately is that, and this is kind of the origin of how Leanpub came about. In like what you described is actually very much like what Peter's inspiration for the idea in the first place. But for some reason, probably the modernists and the representation of them in sort of the writing about art and artists, we see writing as a solitary endeavor. And the thing that just comes true is true over and over again in all these years that I've been talking to over 300 authors or so on this podcast is bringing in other people. This is one of the most important things for finishing writing a book, is bringing in other people at some point to read, to give you comments, but nothing could be a better motivation than a paying reader along the way, because you feel responsible for hitting that deadline. And it's not because you'll disappoint the publisher who's paid you in advance or something like that. It's no, they've paid you to do this and you feel an obligation to do it. And it's so structuring your work around obligations to other people, but the best kind, right? The kind that they want. And you want from them too, is this just mutually reinforcing positive feedback effect for finishing books. The last thing I always like to ask on a podcast, if the guest is an author who's been using Leanpub, is while you've been using Leanpub, and I guess it may have been for a long time now, if there's one thing that had you constantly shaking your fist and shouting at the computer going, damn you, Leanpub, that we could fix for you, or if there was one magical feature, if you could ask us anything, build anything, is there anything that you can think you would ask us to fix or to build for you?
I'm actually laughing at myself because you think as a former tester, quality professional, I would probably have a list of 15 things that I would have ready, and in my mind has gone totally blank. I guess at the moment, right now, I am looking eagerly at sales, so I'm focused in that area. I think I guess, it's either one email or no email. Like, is it constant emails every time you get a purchase over none? It would be nice to have some sort of weekly status type of thing. I think that might be useful. So those forms of feedback. There's a whole heap of things I could comment on, but I can't remember what they are.
Well, you've got my email, so you can.
Yeah, I will. I probably will.
Please do. I mean,
Bug report.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of our jokes at Leanpub, is because so many of the authors are people, professionals like you. We have the best kind of like customers we could possibly hope for when it comes to things like that, because they're like professional software developers and testers and stuff.
I mean, I guess I'd prefer to twist and say what I really like about the platform. I mean, the things that I really enjoy about the platform is that you have your agency and your autonomy. And I think like that is so important when you're writing your voice. And I think that's the thing, it's getting your voice out there. And that Leanpub is a way of helping that happen, and I think that's awesome. And I think I've actually really enjoyed, this might not be for everyone, but I've really enjoyed the GitHub integration and being forced to provide commits constantly and integrating that into having a pipeline that sort of created and did previews and stuff like that. I really enjoyed that aspect, that geeky side of Leanpub.
I was just going to say, we're huge nerds, but it is true that all books should be written in GitHub. They should be written in Git and GitHub. That is just a true fact. They should be written in plain text. Now there's all kinds of reasons for that. But yeah, thank you very much for sharing that positive feedback. And when it comes to notifications about sales, I mean, everyone would love to have the problem of getting too many. But we actually don't. It's true. We've been getting this request from more authors lately, but like dashboards or yeah, weekly summaries or something like that. So we do have a sales page for every book that can show like last 30 days. I think it's last week, last 30 days, and like lifetime or something like that. Maybe it's last 30 days, last 3 months, lifetime or something like that. But it's not very broken down. It's not sort of like kind of, very pro kind of level kind of monitoring that kind of data.
Fair. I think actually now all the ideas are coming in. I would love you to integrate into lulu.com so I could hard copy publish through, because I think I've looked at all the different ones and I've kind of really don't want to publish on Amazon for ethical reasons. And I like the way Lulu has set itself up in the sense of the autonomy and the agency. It feels similar to what I'm receiving through Leanpub. So if there was an API I could integrate or something like that, that would be super cool.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
They have an API.
Yeah, no, I don't. They didn't last I checked. But
Yeah.
this question, so we've gotten this question before in various forms, which is like, awesome, I can click a button to publish my book in ebook form on Leanpub. Wouldn't it be great if when I'm done, I could just set some parameters on Leanpub, click a button, and get my book in print? And basically, that's just way more complicated than it might seem.
Yeah.
Like one of dealing, like there are services out there that'll do it for you, but one way or another, there's all kinds of complications between those two things. And so what we
Yeah.
try to do is we try to provide people with exactly what they need to go out into the jungle and try and hack their way through it, which is a ready PDF that you can easily, like you can generate it more as many times as you need to get exactly what you need. Or Amazon KDP if you're using that, or Lulu, or Ingram Spark, or what have you. But that getting, I mean, going from the world of bits to the world of, paper is hard.
Yeah. No, I just checked it. I mean, Lulu do have an API at the moment. They've published one, so I'm looking into that to see how I can integrate that. Yeah.
That's cool.
So yeah, but definitely looking down that path. And listen, just thanks for putting Leanpub. I've known Leanpub for so long, and kind of I think it's kind of a geek, for me anyway.
Well, definitely. Yeah. Well, I mean, thanks very much, Anne-Marie, for taking
Not at all.
out of your day to talk to
Yeah.
me. I'm not sure what time of day it is
Yeah.
in Sydney.
Well, it's much earlier than yours.
Okay. The book is The Quality Coach's Handbook, Mastering the Quality Coach Role in Organizations. I recommend it to everyone who's interested in how this kind of stuff works and in leveling up your career or bringing someone like this into your organization to fix the problems that you're seeing.
Fantastic. Thanks, Len.